All right, friends and neighbors, welcome back. You know, we've been doing a lot with Ubuntu networking, and that got me thinking, what about the other Linux distros? I personally got started on CentOS, and now CentOS has gone to Rocky, and so maybe we ought to talk just a little bit about, what you can expect if you run into another distro, or you decide that Ubuntu is not the thing for you. So first up, if you're like me and you've spent time on CentOS, then you're used to things like network scripts, ifconfig, .eth1 or whatever the file name was. But Rocky Linux is, it's kind of new. So the story about Rocky Linux goes like this. Red Hat moved away from the development of CentOS. So you've probably seen CentOS Stream. And so the original founder, Greg Kurtzer, started Rocky Linux in honor of his original co-founder, which, who is no longer with us. So when you look at Rocky 8, it had a lot of similarities to the early generation CentOS, and even CentOS 7, CentOS 8. And the reason I'm talking about Rocky Linux instead of some other distro is because a lot of folks that I work with like Rocky Linux, and so we're moving that way in some of our labs and for some of our systems. So there you have it. So that's why we're talking about Rocky Linux. Now there are some similarities if you look at Rocky 8, but now Rocky 9 is moving away from some of that. So if you remember, again, if you looked at early CentOS or previous generations of CentOS and then maybe even early generations of Rocky Linux, you had the same sort of structure, right? /etc/sysconfig/network scripts, and then that's where all of your files were, and you could add those directly, or you could use some kind of network manager interface. But that is all changing. Now, before we get too nutty, let's realize that there are a lot of crossover hits, right? There's a lot of things that stay the same. So a lot of Linux distributions have adopted the IP command. Just like we did in Ubuntu, you can use IPA, IProute, and one of my current new favorite, and I'll show it to you here in a second, the IP-C. I just love it. Routing is, for the most part, the same. You can simply set the IP forwarding bit for IPv4 to 1, or you can edit the syscontrol.conf file. So that is pretty much the same if you want to turn a Linux box into a router. Bridging is a little bit different. So Ubuntu, as you know, uses the net plan. And you edit that file and you take a look in there and you can create a bridge group, right? You can put a couple of interfaces in there and then you run netplan apply. And you can build it that way. You could also have installed bridge control instead of using bridge if you wanted to. So there are a lot of times that I install older tools. So you can do that the same way. Now Rocky, I'll show you in a little bit here. Rocky uses the network manager text user interface and the network manager command line interface. And in my opinion, fooling around with them, they're not quite as intuitive for creating bridge groups as bridge control would be. So if you were going to work with another distro and you had to do something that was a little clunky and you weren't used to it, you might just try bridge control. It's just a little easier to work with, in my opinion. And of course, bridge control can be installed via your favorite packet manager. Now, a quick note on a lot of the demos that we've done here. A lot of them have had the firewall disabled because we're either internal, we're working with some VMs. If that's not the case, you'll see a lot of sites will talk about IP tables or setting up IP table rules. And you might have to do that if you've got a firewall in place. And so forwarding IP packets or something like that is not enough. You might have to do some rule sets too. Okay, that aside, let's move on here and we'll talk about some of the tools. So what does Rocky 9 do? Well, if you look at the docs, and I think you should, the configuration information used to be in /etc sysconfig network scripts. Well, it's not there anymore. It's going to be in etc network manager system config. And we're using what we call key files for the various objects. So the bottom part is just some screenshots from the VMs that I'm going to show you here in a second. This is the content or the output of the network manager config. So that's what that looks like. That's not an individual file. We'll take a look at those here in a second. And this is just showing the location and what a file looks like. Now, if you were going to fool around with stuff, how would you do your manipulation? Well, as mentioned previously, you can use IP. So that's whether you're doing Ubuntu or CentOS or Rocky Linux, you can use IP. But Rocky also recommends the use of the nmtui or nmcli commands. And so these are just the descriptions from the man pages. The nmtui or nmtui is a curses-based text user interface application for interacting with Network Manager. So Network Manager is the heart of this whole thing. And then we just have a couple of ways to interact with it. The nmcli is another way to do this, but it's just a command line tool. We'll see here in a second, there's quite a bit of difference between operating with the two. And I think it's pretty easy to argue that the nmtui is easier to work with, but might not be as scriptable. And so if you're going to write a program that interacts, it might be easier to do it with the CLI tool. Okay, let's take a look at our VMs. So first up, this is a CentOS VM. You can see this. This happens to be a CentOS 7. And if I do a pwd here, right, this is what we're used to, the /etc sysconfig network scripts. And if I was going to take a look at what's in this directory, right, the ifconfig -emp0s3, right, that is the configuration file for this particular interface. And so if we take a look at that, it is, what we've come to know and love from a CentOS configuration file. Pretty straightforward. Where we would put the device name is where you could change the device name. We've got the ID for the device, and then, are we going to do IP addresses that are static, DHCP, and like that. Okay, so now let's take a look at the Rocky Linux. So I guess, first of all, you can see the stuff that I've got on the screen, but I'll go ahead and run it again. If I wanted to look at the configuration for Network Manager, right, how it's currently configured. Now, this is just a minimal ISO that I used here. And so it's got a fairly straightforward or simple build to it, not a whole lot of services installed, other than some networking, and I just made sure Python was there, but that's it. So here is, right, our basic Network Manager config file, and this just tells us a little bit about how Network Manager is configured, and there's nothing special here going on. Now, where are we for this, right? This, as we said, there are a couple of ways to interact with Network Manager. So really, that's at the heart of this. And maybe what we'll do is an ls here, and here is the only file that's here for my interface connection. So we'll do a, there we go. So it actually winds up being kind of similar to the YAML organization that we saw in Ubuntu, right? We have some groupings here, but there's our interface name, the UID, and the ID, the text-based ID. And then how we're going to configure our IPv4 network characteristics. Okay, so now what would happen if I wanted to work with this? Well, there we go. So the nmtui actually brings up a text-based user interface, as we might expect. And if I wanted to edit a connection, this looks very similar to what you would see when you're doing a Linux build, right? When you're doing the initial install. And this is where I would change everything to be, whatever I wanted it to be. But there you go. So this is the nmtui, and you can sort of imagine that this might not be easily scriptable, or perhaps as easy as the command line interface might be. Okay, so now let's take a look at, we'll take a look at some of the options. I'm not going to do a big configuration here, but this is nmcli without arguments. But if we take a look at the man page, right, This is where we could do on the command line all kinds of modifications in the same way that we did with IP, right? We could change IP addresses, we could change the gateway, DNS, all of that with nmcli. As you can see, the man page is quite large, and I'm probably giving you some bugged out eyes by scrolling like that, so I apologize. But there you go. So nmcli is very similar to the IP command in terms of what you can do on the command line, but it is a common way to deal with configuration parameters, well, from the command line. Now, I almost forgot to show you my favorite thing that I've just started doing. I don't know how I wasn't doing this before, but we know we can do stuff like this, right? We do IPA, and I'm used to a very monochromatic world. Sometimes I'll change the screen to green so I can feel like I'm in the Matrix, but what about this? How cool is that? Now, if you already knew this, congratulations, you one-upped me on this one. But I just started doing this, and it just makes reading the screen and finding little pieces of information a lot easier. Well, there you go. So that is the cool thing for the day. All right, well, that was a quick look into, what you might run into if you were dealing with another version of or another fork off of Linux. So we spent a lot of time with Ubuntu, and this was, a blast from the past, CentOS, and what Rocky does today. Remember that there are a couple things that you can use no matter what, right? You can use IP, you can set up routing in the same way. You can install tools like Bridge Control to get things done. But of course, now we have to be aware that there are some other ways to do this, and there's some movement in each distro to sort of maybe, not separate, but maybe direct you in a particular direction. So we see the net plan used in Ubuntu, and then nmtui and nmcli in Rocky Linux. But of course, those are available in other distros as well. Well, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. Like and subscribe for more networking goodness, and may those packets always reach their destination no matter what distro you're fond of.